It has come down to this. An emergency request to the U.S. Supreme Court for a stay of execution in the case of Theodore Bundy has been rejected this evening. The vote was 5-4. Bundy is scheduled to die in Florida's electric chair tomorrow morning at 7. There may still be some last-ditch legal maneuvers that could cause yet another delay in the execution, including an appeal for clemency to the governor of Florida. But just by way of background, since 1925 in Florida, there have been 202 appeals for clemency, and only 6 have been granted. And Governor Bob Martinez, who will have to make that clemency decision on Ted Bundy, has already indicated that he wants the execution to take place. Indeed, Bundy's murders, those for which he is being executed, there are 3, and at least 20 others to which he has confessed, have made his execution a rather popular event. Here's more on the Bundy story from Nightline correspondent Judd Rose.
These are just a few of Ted Bundy's victims, the dead and the living.
I say this for each member of my family, and I'm certain for the other families too. Nothing is ever the same again.
I find myself even now when I'm in a crowd looking for
everything he did to the girls, the bludgeoning and the strangulation, humiliating their bodies, torturing them. I feel that the electric chair is too good for him.
After almost 10 years on death row, Theodore Robert Bundy finally met the fate he had spent a lifetime running from. He was 42 years old when Florida's electric chair ended his life inside the state prison at Stark. By that morning, January 24th, 1989, the whole world knew his name. He wasn't just a killer. He was the charming law student, the political volunteer, the clean-cut young man next door who turned out to be a sadistic predator. Bundy confessed to murdering more than 30 women across 7 states, though detectives believe there were many more, possibly over 100. At 7:16 a.m., the current surged through his body. Ted Bundy was dead. He refused to speak any final words, though just hours earlier he had tried one last time to save himself, blaming pornography for turning him into a murderer. It was another lie from a man who had built his whole life on lies. In his final days, Bundy offered police a deal: more time to live in exchange for the locations of victims who had never been found. But the families of those women had waited long enough. They didn't want bargains or stories. They didn't want to see the burial sites. They just wanted him gone, and the nightmare to finally end. And so Bundy died with his secrets still buried in the woods, taking with him the final resting places of women who never came home. Outside the prison gates, a crowd gathered, not to mourn, but to celebrate. They cheered and waved signs that read, "Burn Bundy, burn." Fireworks lit the morning sky. Vendors even sold t-shirts mocking his death. It felt like a carnival. For once, America was united in agreement. This monster deserved to die. But Bundy's story wasn't just about murder. It was about deception. How evil can hide in plain sight. He made the world face an uncomfortable truth. Evil doesn't always look frightening. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it speaks politely. Sometimes it asks for help. And on one cold night in Florida, that smile walked through the door of a college sorority house. It was a quiet winter night in the state capitol. Inside the Chi Omega sorority house at 661 West Jefferson Street, 39 young women were asleep. They were students, bright, hopeful, and full of plans for the future. None of them knew a killer had been watching their home for days, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The back door lock was broken. The women had complained, but no one had fixed it. That single act of neglect would change everything. Just after 3 a.m., Bundy slipped through the unlocked door. He carried a heavy oak club, a crude but deadly weapon. For the next 15 minutes, horror unfolded inside the house. Margaret Bowman, 21, was beaten as she slept, her skull shattered under Bundy's blows. Lisa Levy, 20, was brutally assaulted, bitten, and left lifeless in her bed. In another room, Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler were attacked. Both survived, though Kathy's jaw was broken and Karen's skull cracked open. Their screams finally forced Bundy to flee into the night. But he wasn't finished. Minutes later, he broke into another home nearby and bludgeoned Cheryl Thomas, a dance student, leaving her permanently deaf in one ear. In under an hour, he had attacked 5 women. 2 were dead. 3 would bear the scars forever. When police arrived at Chi Omega, the scene was like a nightmare. Blood spattered the walls. 2 young women lay dead in their beds. But Bundy made a mistake. On Lisa Levy's body, investigators found a distinct bite mark, one that would later become the key evidence that finally tied him to the murders. And then, just weeks after the Chi Omega killings, while Florida was still reeling, Bundy struck one last time. On February 9, 1978, in the small town of Lake City, 12-year-old Kimberly Leach disappeared from her middle school. She was a sweet, shy girl. Classmates remembered her carrying her books pressed against her chest, always polite, always smiling. That morning, she had gone to pick up a forgotten purse from her homeroom. She never made it back. For 7 long weeks, her family searched and prayed. Then, their worst fears came true. Kimberly's body was found in a pig shed near Suwannee River State Park. Discarded, assaulted, and strangled. Animals had partially mutilated her remains before investigators found her. The sight broke even the most hardened officers. It was the cruelest act of all, the murder of a child who had her whole life ahead of her. That single killing sealed Bundy's fate. Even those who had once seen him as charming now saw the truth, a remorseless predator who preyed on innocence itself. Years later, during his Florida trial, prosecutors would call Kimberly's death the final proof that the devil walks in human form. And they weren't wrong. But what most people didn't know was that Bundy should never have been free to kill again. Because before the Florida murders, he had escaped from custody. Not once, but twice. The first time was in June 1977, from the Picken County Courthouse in Colorado, where he was allowed to represent himself in court. While guards were distracted, Bundy opened a window and jumped from the 2nd floor, disappearing into the mountains. He was caught 6 days later, starving, exhausted, but still scheming. The second escape came 6 months later, in December 1977, from the Garfield County Jail. He sawed a hole through the ceiling of his cell, crawled through the crawl space, and dropped into the jailer's apartment. Then he simply walked out the front door and vanished. This time, he stayed free for 46 days, long enough to travel across the country, adopt fake identities, and resume killing. Those escapes gave him the opportunity to attack again, to murder the Chi Omega victims and the little girl, Kimberly Leach. Every life taken after those escapes was another failure of the system, another reminder of how dangerous his manipulation truly was. And to understand how it all came to this, how a clean-cut law student turned into one of history's most notorious serial killers, we have to go back. Back to the young victims who trusted him, the survivors who escaped him, and the investigators who finally brought him down. Back to a time when no one believed that the man with the perfect smile was a monster. This is the story of Ted Bundy, how he killed, how he escaped, how he manipulated, and how he almost got away with everything. If you're drawn to stories of justice, betrayal, and the people who reach a point of no return, make sure to subscribe to No Way Out. This is where true crime meets truth. Real cases, real consequences. The darkest corners of human decision broken down into tiny pieces so you can see every detail and make your own conclusions better. Ted Bundy was born on November 24, 1946, in Burlington, Vermont. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was only 22 years old and unmarried. She gave birth at a home for unwed mothers called the Elizabeth Lund Home. She named her baby Theodore Robert Cowell. The identity of Ted's father was a mystery. Eleanor wrote down a name on the birth certificate, Lloyd Marshall, who she said was an Air Force veteran. However, this information may not have been true. Years later, some family members suggested something disturbing, that Eleanor's own father, Samuel Cowell, might actually have been Ted's father. This would mean Ted was the product of incest, though this was never confirmed. For 3 months, Eleanor and her infant son stayed at the home. She considered adoption. Her father had other plans. Samuel Cowell wanted the child brought back to Philadelphia, to the family home at 3300 North 12th Street. Eleanor agreed. What happened next would shape Theodore's entire life. The Cowell family created a story. Theodore would believe his grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, were his parents. His mother would be introduced as his older sister. This deception was meant to protect the family from shame in 1940s America, where unwed mothers faced severe social judgment. Samuel Cowell worked as a church deacon and cultivated a respectable image in the community. Behind closed doors, accounts of his behavior varied. Some family members later described him as violent and abusive, prone to rage. Others in the community remembered him differently, as a kind man, beloved by his daughters. These conflicting memories would create confusion about Theodore's early influences. Eleanor Cowell, Theodore's grandmother, reportedly suffered from depression and received electroconvulsive therapy. Some accounts stated she was agoraphobic, afraid to leave the house in her later years. Recent investigations questioned these characterizations, with family members suggesting she simply had mobility issues from a stroke. Young Theodore lived in this household for his first 4 years. He was a quiet child. One disturbing incident stood out. Theodore's aunt, Julia Cowell, woke from a nap one afternoon to find 3-year-old Theodore standing beside her bed, smiling. He had placed kitchen knives around her body while she slept. The family dismissed this as childish curiosity. It was not. Theodore showed intelligence early. He seemed observant, quiet, different from other children. His mother Eleanor appeared to dote on him, frequently telling him he was special, destined for great things. This attention created a bond between them that would last decades. In 1950, everything changed. Eleanor decided to leave Philadelphia. She was tired of the lie, tired of living as her son's sister rather than his mother. She wanted a fresh start somewhere new, somewhere she could be honest about her relationship with Theodore. She changed her surname from Cowell to Nelson for this new beginning. They married in 1951. Johnny formally adopted young Theodore, who became Theodore Robert Bundy, the name that would one day become known worldwide. The boy was now 5 years old. He had spent his early years believing his grandparents were his parents and that his mother was his older sister. The truth about his mother's identity had recently been revealed to him, though exactly when and how this conversation happened remained unclear in later accounts. This early deception and confusion about his identity would leave lasting psychological scars. Theodore showed visible resentment toward his new stepfather. Johnny Bundy tried to connect with his adopted son. He took Theodore camping, fishing, and various father-son activities that Theodore showed little interest in. The boy remained distant and cold toward Johnny. The Bundy family grew. Johnny and Eleanor had 4 children together over the next several years. Theodore became an older brother to these half-siblings. He occasionally helped care for them, but maintained emotional distance. Theodore attended local schools in Tacoma. Teachers found him intelligent but withdrawn. He struggled to make friends. Other children sensed something different about him. Theodore was shy to the point of dysfunction, unable to engage in normal childhood social interactions. A neighbor girl named Sandy Holt remembered Theodore from their childhood in Tacoma. He liked to scare people, she recalled decades later. Theodore dug holes in the ground, placed stakes inside, covered them with vegetation. He called them tiger traps. At least one girl fell in and injured her leg. When confronted, Theodore showed no remorse. Another childhood behavior emerged. Theodore began taking things that did not belong to him, small items at first. This progressed to shoplifting from stores. He stole ski lift tickets. The thefts were not driven by need. The Bundy family had enough money for necessities. Theodore stole for the thrill, for the sense of control. Reports also surfaced of cruelty to animals. Theodore allegedly trapped mice in the woods near his home and pulled them apart while they were still alive. This behavior, combined with the tiger traps, suggested something deeply wrong in the child's psychological development. Elementary school and middle school passed. Theodore's intelligence became more apparent. He earned good grades without much effort. His social skills remained poor. He had no close friends, no real connections with peers. He existed on the periphery of normal childhood. Then came high school, and something shifted. Theodore began to change his presentation. He paid attention to how popular students dressed and spoke. He started to imitate them. This wasn't natural social development, it was calculated mimicry. Theodore was learning to wear a mask. By his junior and senior years at Woodrow Wilson High School, Theodore had transformed his image. He dressed well, spoke politely, joined activities. Teachers and classmates began to describe him as charismatic. But beneath this new exterior, Theodore remained isolated. He rarely dated. He had learned to look normal without actually connecting to other people. This ability to present a false self while hiding his true nature would become Theodore Bundy's most dangerous skill. After graduating in 1965, Theodore enrolled at the University of Puget Sound. He was 18 years old, ready to continue the performance he had perfected in high school. The next several years would establish patterns that defined his adult life. Academic success paired with personal dysfunction and an obsessive focus on a particular type of woman. Theodore changed schools after just 1 year, transferring to the University of Washington in Seattle. He chose to study Chinese language and culture, an unusual choice that suggested ambition. He wanted to appear sophisticated and worldly. But the choice also revealed his tendency to select goals based on how they would make him look to others rather than genuine interest. Everything was about image, about the mask he wore for the world. Money remained tight. Theodore worked various jobs to pay for school. He was a busboy, a shoe clerk, other low-level positions. Employers found him unreliable. He rarely stayed with one job for long. His work ethic failed to match his carefully crafted image of success. Despite his job troubles, Theodore excelled academically when he chose to focus. Professors found him intelligent and articulate. He could discuss complex ideas and write compelling papers. This intellectual ability, combined with his improving social mask, made him seem like a young man headed for success. Then came spring 1967. Theodore met a woman whose name has been kept private to protect her identity. She was everything Theodore was not. Wealthy, sophisticated, from a prominent California family. She had dark hair parted in the middle, an attractive appearance, confidence that came from privilege. Theodore became infatuated immediately. They started dating. For Theodore, this relationship represented validation. He had captured the attention of someone from a higher social class. This meant he was special, worthy, destined for the greatness his mother always promised him. He poured all his energy into impressing this woman. She enjoyed Theodore's company initially. They shared interests in skiing and outdoor activities. Theodore was attentive, charming when he wanted to be, but she noticed problems. Theodore had no clear direction in life. He talked about big plans but took no concrete steps toward them. He lied frequently, exaggerating his accomplishments and connections. By 1968, the relationship crumbled. The woman broke up with Theodore, telling him he lacked maturity and focus. She returned to California. Theodore was devastated. The rejection hit him with force that seemed disproportionate to a normal college relationship ending. Theodore stopped attending classes. He dropped out of the University of Washington. Depression consumed him. He couldn't eat or sleep properly. He wrote letters to the woman in California, long rambling messages that she largely ignored. She had moved on. Theodore could not. This rejection appeared to trigger something in Theodore. The woman who rejected him became an obsession. She represented everything he wanted and couldn't have: status, wealth, acceptance. Theodore eventually pulled himself together enough to re-enroll at the University of Washington. He changed his major to psychology. This choice was calculated. Theodore wanted to understand manipulation, persuasion, how to read and control people. Psychology gave him a framework for these interests. He also became involved in politics. Theodore volunteered for moderate Republican campaigns. Politics provided another mask, another role to play. He could present as a clean-cut young conservative, the kind of person who succeeded in conventional society. Behind this image, Theodore was learning skills he would later use for much darker purposes. In September 1969, Elizabeth Klopfer sat at a table at the Sandpiper Tavern in Seattle with her friend Marilyn Chino. Elizabeth was recently divorced, working as a secretary at the University of Washington Medical School. She had a 3-year-old daughter named Tina. Life as a single mother was difficult, isolating. A man at the bar kept looking in her direction. Elizabeth noticed him staring. He was good-looking, well-dressed, and seemed different from the usual bar crowd. When a drunk man started bothering Elizabeth and Marilyn, the man from the bar intervened. He sat down at their table. Theodore Bundy introduced himself as Ted, a law student. This was a lie. He was still an undergraduate studying psychology, but lying came naturally to him. Elizabeth found him charming. He seemed genuinely interested in her and her daughter. When the bar closed, Ted offered to walk Elizabeth to her car. They talked easily. Elizabeth felt an immediate connection. She gave Ted her phone number, though she didn't expect him to call. Men who seemed too good to be true usually were. But Ted called the next day. He asked her to dinner. Their relationship developed quickly. Ted came to Elizabeth's apartment frequently. He was good with Tina, playing with her, reading to her. He helped around the house. For Elizabeth, Ted seemed like the answer to her struggles. A kind, intelligent man who accepted her daughter and wanted to build a life together. Elizabeth had no idea what Ted actually was. She couldn't have known. Ted's mask was perfect at this stage. He presented as a caring boyfriend, a father figure to Tina, a man with a promising future. Behind this facade, darkness was growing. Elizabeth and Ted fell into a routine. They spent weekends together, going on outings with Tina, cooking dinners, acting like a family. Ted moved in with Elizabeth informally, keeping clothes at her apartment, spending most nights there. Elizabeth felt happy for the first time since her divorce. But there were signs, small things that bothered her. Ted's moods shifted unpredictably. He could be warm and affectionate one moment, then cold and distant the next. He would shut Elizabeth out emotionally without explanation, leaving her confused and desperate to fix whatever she had done wrong. Then he would suddenly be loving again, as if nothing had happened. Ted also had no money, despite supposedly being a law student. He borrowed from Elizabeth frequently. His excuses for being broke varied, none of them quite making sense. Elizabeth suspected he was stealing, but she pushed these thoughts away. She was in love. In 1970, Ted and Elizabeth went to the courthouse to get a marriage license. Elizabeth was thrilled. They were making it official. But days later, when Elizabeth asked Ted to temporarily move his belongings out because her conservative parents were visiting, Ted exploded. He accused her of being ashamed of him, of not being ready for commitment. He tore up the marriage license and stormed out. This pattern repeated throughout their relationship. Ted would pull Elizabeth close, make promises, act committed. Then he would push her away, disappear for days, make her feel worthless. Elizabeth described feeling like she was nothing when Ted withdrew his attention, like she only existed when he chose to acknowledge her. Strange items began appearing in Elizabeth's home. She found plaster of Paris in Ted's things, crutches, a meat cleaver on his desk, surgical gloves in his coat pocket. When Elizabeth questioned these items, Ted always had explanations. The plaster was for a project, the crutches were for a friend, the meat cleaver was for cooking. His explanations were smooth, believable, delivered with confidence. Elizabeth wanted to believe him. She had invested so much in this relationship, built her life around Ted. Tina called him Dad. The idea that something was wrong with Ted, that he might be dangerous, seemed impossible. In 1972, Ted graduated from the University of Washington with a degree in psychology. Elizabeth was proud. He had accomplished something significant. But Ted's behavior became more erratic. He disappeared for longer periods. His explanations about where he had been became vague. Elizabeth's anxiety increased. Throughout 1973, Ted seemed to be drifting. He worked odd jobs but couldn't hold them. He talked about law school but didn't apply. He spent time alone, driving around at night, behavior he couldn't or wouldn't explain to Elizabeth. Something was changing inside him. The fantasies he'd harbored for years were no longer enough. Despite her concerns, Elizabeth stayed. She loved Ted. She believed he loved her. She couldn't imagine her life without him. This loyalty, this refusal to see the truth that was emerging, would haunt Elizabeth for the rest of her life. By late 1973, young women were beginning to disappear in the Seattle area, though the pattern wasn't yet clear to police. Elizabeth noticed nothing, still trapped in her cycle of hope and disappointment with Ted. She had no idea that the man she loved, the man who played with her daughter, was becoming something monstrous. The violence that had been building inside Ted finally erupted in January 1974. January 4th, 1974, early morning hours, Seattle's University District. Karen Sparks, 18 years old, slept in her basement bedroom. She was a student at the University of Washington, studying dance. Her roommates were upstairs, unaware of the intruder who had entered through an unlocked door. Theodore Bundy moved quietly through the house. He had been planning this for weeks, watching the house, learning the layout, waiting for the right moment. The urge to act had been building in him for months, possibly years. Tonight, he would not resist it anymore. He found Karen's bedroom. She was alone, vulnerable, asleep. Ted attacked her brutally with a metal rod, beating her and sexually assaulting her. Karen survived, but barely. Her roommates found her the next morning, lying in blood-soaked sheets. She had a fractured skull, brain damage, and was in a coma. Doctors gave her little chance of recovery. Somehow, Karen lived, though she suffered permanent neurological damage. She had no memory of the attack and could not identify her attacker. Police investigated but had few leads. The attack seemed motiveless, random. Karen had no enemies, no ex-boyfriends with grudges. The brutality suggested someone mentally disturbed, but there were no suspects. The case went cold quickly. Ted returned to his normal life. On February 1st, 1974. Linda Ann Healy disappeared from her basement bedroom in another University District house. Linda was 21, also a student at the University of Washington. She worked at a ski resort and gave the daily ski report on the radio each morning. Listeners across Seattle knew her voice. Linda never showed up for work on February 1st. Her roommates checked her room. The bed had been carefully made. Blood stained the pillowcase and mattress. Linda's nightgown hung in the closet, also blood-stained. Her clothes and backpack were missing. The window was slightly open. Police found no signs of forced entry. Whoever took Linda had been careful, methodical. He had cleaned up evidence, remade the bed, took her clothes to make it look like she had left voluntarily. This was different from the Karen Sparks attack. This showed planning, organization, sophistication. Linda's parents were devastated. They appeared on television, begging for information. Linda's face was on the news every night. Posters went up across Seattle, but there were no witnesses, no useful evidence. Linda had simply vanished. Ted watched the news coverage. He saw Linda's parents crying. He felt nothing. Or perhaps he felt satisfaction. He had taken someone important, someone whose voice people knew. The attention pleased him. On March 12th, 1974, another girl, Donna Gail Manson, 19 years old, left her dormitory at Evergreen State College in Olympia to attend a jazz concert on campus. She never arrived. Donna was small, had dark hair parted in the middle, wore a distinctive green backpack. Multiple people saw her walking toward the concert venue. Then she was gone. Evergreen State College searched for Donna. They found nothing. Her backpack never turned up. Her body was never found. Police had no evidence, no leads. Donna's family waited for answers that wouldn't come for years. The pattern was emerging, though police didn't recognize it yet. Young women with dark hair parted in the middle were vanishing from college campuses in Washington. The disappearances occurred roughly 1 month apart. Each victim was taken carefully, leaving minimal evidence. Ted was refining his technique. He learned from each abduction. Karen Sparks had been messy, impulsive. He had left her alive, left evidence. With Linda Healy, he had been more careful. With Donna Manson, he left no trace at all. These 3 attacks in the first few months of 1974 were just the beginning. Ted had discovered something dark inside himself. He could no longer control it. Maybe he didn't even want to control it anymore. The murders would get worse from here. The night of April 17, 1974, would change everything for one family. At Central Washington State College in Ellensburg, Susan Elaine Rancourt was 18 years old. Around 9 o'clock that evening, she left her dorm room. She was going to watch a German-language film on campus. Susan was a freshman who took her studies seriously. She was careful and cautious by nature. She told her roommate, "I'll be back by 11. Susan never came back. Her roommate waited. She got worried as midnight came and went. By morning, everyone knew something terrible had happened. Police searched the entire campus and the areas around it. They found nothing. No trace of Susan, no witnesses who saw anything strange. What the police didn't know, Ted Bundy had approached Susan that night. He was using a trick he was getting better and better at. He wore a fake cast on his arm. He carried books but held them awkwardly, like he couldn't manage them. He looked like just another college student who needed help. Ted asked Susan if she could help him carry his books to his car. Susan was a kind person. She said yes. When they got to his tan Volkswagen Beetle, Ted attacked. He had a crowbar hidden in the car. He hit Susan hard, knocking her out. He threw her in the vehicle and drove away. The whole thing took less than 2 minutes. No one saw what happened. Later, Susan's body ended up on Taylor Mountain with other victims. By the time she was found, she was so badly decomposed that she was barely recognizable. On May 6, 1974, Roberta Kathleen Parks was walking across the campus of Oregon State University in Corvallis. She was 20 years old. Everyone called her Kathy. She was walking to the Student Union building when she disappeared. Just like the others, she vanished completely. No witnesses, no evidence, no body found right away. Ted had driven all the way to Oregon just to kidnap Kathy. He was going to different places on purpose. He was making it harder for police to connect the disappearances. Different areas meant different police departments. Different police departments meant different investigators who weren't talking to each other. Ted knew this would keep him safe longer. Less than a month later, Ted was back in the Seattle area, hunting again. It was June 1st, 1974 at the Flame Tavern in Berrien, a suburb of Seattle. It was Saturday night and the bar was packed with people. Brenda Carol Ball was 22 years old. She was at the bar that night, enjoying herself. Around 2 in the morning, she decided to leave and go home. Several people saw her in the parking lot talking to a good-looking man. Then she was gone. Brenda was different from the previous victims in some ways. She was slightly older. She wasn't a college student, but she looked like all the others. Dark hair parted down the middle, attractive, thin. Ted was following a specific type. He was repeating the same pattern over and over, choosing victims based on what his twisted mind wanted. 10 days later, Ted would strike again, this time back on a college campus. It was June 11, 1974, at the University of Washington. The campus was quiet in the early morning hours. Georgianne Hawkins was 18 years old. Around 1 in the morning, she left her boyfriend's dorm building. She was walking back to her sorority house. The walk was short, only about 100 yards. That's less than the length of a football field. The alley was well lit. There were streetlights everywhere. Georgianne's roommate actually heard her come into the building. She heard her go into the bathroom, then she heard nothing else. Georgianne was gone. Witnesses saw something important that night. They saw a man with his leg in a cast. He was on crutches. He was near the alley where Georgianne disappeared. He was carrying a briefcase and struggling to walk. He asked several people for help carrying his stuff. Most people were too busy or didn't trust him. Something felt off about him. But Georgianne stopped to help. She was a kind person who wanted to help someone who seemed hurt. That's what got her killed. Police finally saw the pattern. 5 young women had vanished from Washington colleges and the surrounding areas. All of this happened in just 5 months, from January to June 1974. The disappearances showed planning. They showed organization. This wasn't random violence from some crazy person. This was a predator hunting systematically, like a wolf picking off prey. But police had no suspect. They had descriptions of the man with crutches. People said he was good-looking. He spoke well. He was maybe 6 feet tall with dark hair. But this description could fit thousands of men in the Seattle area. The tan Volkswagen Beetle was one of the most common cars in America at that time. Police had nothing solid to work with. They didn't have fingerprints. They didn't have DNA evidence. DNA testing didn't even exist yet. They didn't have a license plate number. They had descriptions that could match almost anyone. And Ted Bundy kept killing. Investigators created a task force. They compiled lists of known sex offenders, interviewed hundreds of people, pursued every lead. Nothing produced a viable suspect. The killer was smart, careful, leaving no useful evidence at any scene. By the end of June 1974, Ted had killed at least 6 women, possibly more. His technique was refined. He knew how to select victims, how to approach them, how to avoid leaving evidence. He knew police were looking for him, and this added to his sense of power. The pressure inside Ted was building. The monthly pattern he had followed couldn't satisfy him anymore. He needed more, needed to act more frequently. July would bring the escalation that would finally give police something to work with. July 14, 1974, was a perfect summer Sunday in Washington. Lake Sammamish State Park, about 15 miles east of Seattle, filled with thousands of people seeking relief from the heat. Families spread picnic blankets, teenagers played volleyball, couples walked the beach. The park ranger estimated 12,000 visitors that day. Ted Bundy arrived at the park around noon. He wore a white tennis outfit, had his left arm in a sling, drove his tan Volkswagen Beetle. He looked like any other young man enjoying a day at the beach. But Ted wasn't there to relax. He was hunting. Around 12:30, Janice Ann Ott, 23 years old, rode her bike to the park. Janice was newly married, worked as a probation caseworker. She told her husband she was meeting a friend at the lake. She spread her towel on the grass near the water and lay down to sunbathe. Ted approached Janice. Several people witnessed this interaction. He walked up smiling, gestured to his sling, explained he was trying to load his sailboat onto his car but couldn't manage with one arm. Would she mind helping him? Janice hesitated briefly, then agreed. She got up, walked with Ted toward the parking area, and was never seen alive again. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, Ted was back at the park. The first abduction had gone perfectly. He had secured Janice somewhere. Now he wanted another victim. Denise Marie Naslund, 18 years old, was at the park with her boyfriend and another couple. The group had been drinking beer, playing games. Around 4 in the afternoon, Denise left her group to go to the restroom. She walked across the park alone. Ted intercepted her. Witnesses saw a man in a sling talking to Denise. She looked uncertain, but nodded. They walked together toward the parking lot. Denise's boyfriend waited for her return. After an hour, he grew concerned. By evening, he was frantic. Multiple witnesses came forward. They had seen a good-looking man with his arm in a sling asking women for help. He said his name was Ted. He had a slight accent, maybe Canadian. He wore white tennis clothes. He drove a Volkswagen Beetle, possibly tan or light brown. Several women reported that this man had approached them as well, but they had declined to help him. They remembered feeling uncomfortable, sensing something off about his request. Their instincts saved their lives. Police now had solid information. The killer's name was Ted. He drove a Volkswagen. He used an injury ruse to gain trust. He was active in broad daylight at a crowded public park. This showed extreme confidence and escalating risk-taking behavior. Investigators released a composite sketch based on witness descriptions. The sketch showed a clean-cut young man with neat hair and regular features. The Seattle Times and other newspapers published the sketch prominently. Thousands of tips poured in. Among those tips, Elizabeth Klopfer called police. She was deeply troubled. Her boyfriend's name was Ted. He drove a Volkswagen Beetle. He had recently put a cast on his leg, though he claimed it was for an accident. The physical description matched. Elizabeth's friends had also called, independently suggesting Ted Bundy might be the Lake Sammamish killer. Police added Ted Bundy's name to their list of suspects, but the list contained thousands of names. Ted had no criminal record. He was a law student with political connections. He didn't seem like a serial killer. Investigators prioritized other suspects they considered more likely. While police sorted through thousands of tips, the missing women's families clung to hope. But that hope died in the woods near Issaquah. The morning of September 7, 1974, started like any other for a grouse hunter walking through a wooded area off Interstate 90 near Issaquah. The location was roughly 2 miles from Lake Sammamish State Park. What he found would haunt him forever: human remains scattered through the forest. Police arrived and began the grim work of recovery. Dental records identified the remains. Janice Ott and Denise Naslund, the two women taken from Lake Sammamish in July. A third skull belonged to George Ann Hawkins, who had disappeared from the University of Washington in June. The discovery confirmed what police feared. The missing women were dead, murdered by the same person. The killer had created a dump site where he disposed of multiple victims. This suggested a level of organization and planning that made the case even more disturbing. Ted had used this location before. He had brought George Ann Hawkins's body there in June. He returned with Janice and Denise in July. Ted liked having a place to return to where he could revisit his crimes. This particular spot was isolated but accessible, close enough to Seattle for convenience. The Lake Sammamish case was a turning point. Police finally had witnesses, descriptions, a name, but they still didn't have enough evidence to identify and arrest the killer. Ted remained free, and his confidence was growing. He was ready to expand his territory beyond Washington. August 1974. Ted Bundy moved to Salt Lake City to attend law school at the University of Utah. He had been accepted to multiple programs and chose Utah deliberately. The move put distance between himself and the intense police investigation in Seattle. Utah offered fresh hunting grounds where police weren't looking for him. Ted rented a small apartment near campus. He enrolled in classes, bought textbooks, attended orientations. On the surface, he was following a normal path: graduate school, future career, conventional success. Below the surface, the murders in Washington remained unsolved, and Ted had no intention of stopping. September passed relatively quietly. Ted focused on establishing himself in Salt Lake City, learning the area and identifying potential victims. But the urge to kill hadn't disappeared. It was merely waiting. Then, in early October, Ted couldn't resist anymore. The compulsion was too strong. On October 2nd, 1974, 16-year-old Nancy Wilcox disappeared from Holiday, Utah, a suburb of Salt Lake City. Nancy was last seen riding her bike in her neighborhood, doing something normal teenagers do every day. She never came home. Her body was never found. Police had no evidence connecting her disappearance to anything suspicious. With no witnesses and no clues, Nancy became another missing person statistic. Her family would spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened to her. 16 days later, on October 18, 1974, Ted killed again. Melissa Smith, 17, daughter of the Midvale police chief, disappeared after leaving the pizza restaurant where she worked. Melissa's father immediately organized a massive search. As a law enforcement officer, he knew the first hours were critical, but knowing didn't help. His daughter was gone. 9 days later, hikers found Melissa's body in a canyon near Salt Lake City. She had been raped, beaten, and strangled. Her clothes were torn. Evidence suggested she had been kept alive for several days before being killed. The brutality shocked investigators. On Halloween night, October 31st, 1974, Laura Ann Aim, 17 years old, disappeared after a party in Lehi, Utah. Her body was found on Thanksgiving Day in American Fork Canyon. Like Melissa, she had been beaten and sexually assaulted. She was strangled with a nylon stocking. And then came November 8, 1974, the day that would ultimately lead to Ted's first arrest, though that wouldn't happen for months. 2 separate incidents occurred that evening that illuminated Ted's methods and his increasing recklessness. First incident, early evening. Carol Duranch, 18 years old, was shopping at Fashion Place Mall in Murray, Utah. A man approached her in the mall, flashed a badge, identified himself as Officer Roseland of the Murray Police Department. He told Carol someone had attempted to break into her car in the parking lot. She needed to come with him to file a report. The man seemed official, knew her license plate number. They walked to her car together. When they arrived, nothing appeared wrong with the vehicle. The man insisted she come to the police station 1M. He directed her to get into his Volkswagen Beetle. Once in the car, Carol noticed the man wasn't driving toward the police station. She grew alarmed. The man suddenly pulled over, produced handcuffs, and tried to secure Carol's wrists. She fought. He pulled out a crowbar and tried to hit her. Carol got the passenger door open and fell out of the car onto the street, screaming. A couple in a passing car saw Carol running. They stopped and picked her up. The Volkswagen sped away. Carol was hysterical but uninjured except for minor scrapes. She gave police a detailed description of her attacker and his car. She had escaped, becoming one of the few people to survive an encounter with Ted Bundy. Second incident, same evening, later. Deborah Kent, 17 years old, attended a school play at Viewmont High School in Bountiful, Utah, with her parents. During intermission, Deborah left to pick up her brother from a nearby ice rink. She never arrived at the rink and never returned to the play. Deborah vanished completely. Witnesses saw a Volkswagen Beetle in the school parking lot. A man with his arm in a cast was seen approaching several young women, asking for help. One witness, a drama teacher, remembered the man because of his intense, focused demeanor, but no one saw what happened to Deborah. Police found a handcuff key in the parking lot near where the Volkswagen had been parked. This key would later match the handcuffs used in the Carol Durant attack earlier that day. But at the time, investigators didn't make the connection between the two incidents. Ted had attempted to abduct two women in one evening. One escaped, the other didn't. This represented peak risk-taking. Ted was operating in a frenzy now, unable to control his compulsions. The careful planning of his early murders had given way to increasingly bold daytime attacks in public places. Utah police were investigating multiple disappearances and murders, but like Washington law enforcement, they had no viable suspect. The attacks seemed random, motiveless. The killer left little physical evidence. Witnesses provided descriptions that could fit many young men in the area. Ted continued attending law school through November and December. His grades were mediocre. He wasn't putting in the work. The murders consumed most of his mental energy. He was thinking about previous victims, planning future attacks, reliving each abduction in his mind. Elizabeth Klopfer visited Ted in Utah that Christmas. She noticed his apartment had new belongings, items she didn't recognize. Where had he gotten the money? Ted's explanations were vague. Elizabeth felt uneasy, but pushed her concerns aside once again, trapped in her pattern of denial about who Ted really was. By January 1975, Ted had extended his hunting territory into Colorado. He had killed in Washington and Utah. Now he added a third state, making the investigation even more complicated for law enforcement. Different states meant different jurisdictions, different databases, minimal communication between police departments. On the night of January 12, 1975, Karen Campbell became Colorado's first victim. She was 23 years old, vacationing at the Wildwood Inn in Snowmass Village, Colorado, near Aspen. Karen was a nurse from Michigan, staying at the resort with her fiancé and his children. The evening seemed perfect. Dinner, relaxation, family time in a beautiful location. Around 9:30 at night, Karen went back to her room from the hotel lobby to get a magazine. The elevator ride was short, maybe 30 seconds. The walk down the hallway to her room took less than a minute. Karen never made it. Her fiancé waited in the lobby. After 15 minutes, he grew concerned. He went up to check on her. The room was empty. Karen's belongings were there, but she was gone. He searched the hotel, increasingly panicked. By midnight, police were involved. A month later, on February 17th, a highway worker discovered Karen's body in a snowbank about 2.5 miles from the Wildwood Inn. She had been beaten in the head with a blunt object, sexually assaulted, and left in the snow. Animals had damaged the remains, but the cause of death was clear. 2 months later, on March 15th, 1975, Ted struck again. Julie Cunningham, 26 years old, left her apartment in Vail, Colorado, to meet a friend at a tavern. It was a short walk through the busy ski town. Multiple people were on the streets that evening, enjoying the nightlife. But no one witnessed Julie's abduction. She never arrived at the tavern. Her friend waited, then called Julie's apartment. No answer. By morning, Julie's disappearance became a missing person case. Julie's case frustrated investigators more than any other. There was literally no evidence, no body, no witnesses, no physical clues, no signs of a struggle. Julie simply ceased to exist between her apartment and the tavern, a distance of maybe 3 blocks. Years later, Ted confessed to Julie's murder. He told investigators he had approached her on crutches, playing the injured victim again. He asked for help carrying ski boots to his car. Julie, being kind, agreed to help. Once at the car, he hit her with a crowbar, knocking her unconscious. He threw her in the vehicle and drove to a remote area where he killed her. He disposed of her body in a location so isolated that it was never found. 3 weeks later, on April 6, 1975, Ted killed again, this time in Grand Junction, Colorado. Denise Oliverson, 25 years old, left her apartment on her bicycle. She was riding to visit her parents, a normal Sunday afternoon activity. Witnesses saw Denise riding her bike near a viaduct. Then she vanished. Her bicycle and sandals were found abandoned near the Colorado River. But Denise herself was gone. Her body was never recovered. By spring 1975, the death toll was staggering. Ted had murdered women in 3 states over a 14-month period. Conservative estimates put his victim count at 15 to 20 by this point, though the true number was likely much higher. Some victims were never identified. Some were never connected to Ted. The full extent of his killing spree may never be known. But Ted's luck was running out. His name appeared on suspect lists in Washington and Utah. Multiple people, including Elizabeth Klupfer, had called police suggesting Ted might be the killer. His physical description matched composite sketches. His Volkswagen was the right make and color. The issue was volume. Police in Washington had received thousands of tips. Ted Bundy's name appeared in databases alongside thousands of other names. No investigator had yet pulled together all the information about Ted in one place and recognized the pattern. But that, however, was about to change. If you're finding this deep dive into the Ted Bundy case fascinating, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover the most notorious criminal cases in history with respect for the victims and attention to detail. Hit that like button if you're enjoying this content, and let us know in the comments what case you'd like us to cover next. On August 16, 1975, 2:30 in the morning, Granger, Utah, a small suburb south of Salt Lake City. Utah Highway Patrol Sergeant Bob Hayward was finishing his shift when he noticed a Volkswagen Beetle driving slowly through a residential neighborhood with its headlights off. The car seemed to be casing houses. Hayward decided to follow. When Hayward activated his lights, the Volkswagen suddenly accelerated, running a stop sign. Hayward pursued. The Beetle pulled into a gas station and stopped. The driver got out calmly, as if nothing unusual had happened. He was well-dressed, polite, clean-cut. He identified himself as Ted Bundy, a law student. Hayward asked why Ted had run. Ted said he didn't realize it was a police car, thought maybe it was someone following him. The explanation made no sense, but Ted delivered it smoothly, confidently. He agreed to let Hayward search his car. Inside the Volkswagen, Hayward found items that immediately raised suspicion. A ski mask, a second mask made from pantyhose with eye holes cut out, handcuffs, rope, an ice pick, a crowbar, trash bags, surgical gloves. Ted explained each item. The ski mask was for skiing. He found the handcuffs in a dumpster. The crowbar was for work. The other items were common household objects. Hayward wasn't buying it. He arrested Ted for evading police and possession of burglary tools. Ted was released on his own recognizance later that morning, but the incident triggered something important. Detective Jerry Thompson of the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office heard about the arrest. Thompson was investigating the Carol Durant case and the murder of Melissa Smith. Something about the items in Ted's car caught his attention. Handcuffs, rope, masks. Thompson pulled Ted's name from the suspect database. Ted had been called in as a possible suspect months earlier by his girlfriend in Seattle. Thompson looked at Ted's photo and felt a jolt of recognition. The resemblance to composite sketches was striking. Could this be the man they'd been hunting? Thompson needed to be sure. He needed eyewitness identification. He needed Carol Durant. By September 1975, Thompson had assembled a photo lineup. He included Ted's photo among several others, all similar-looking young men with dark hair. The lineup had to be fair, or a defense attorney would tear it apart in court. Carol Durant came to the police station. She was the woman who had escaped, who had fought for her life and survived. Now she might be the key to catching a serial killer. Thompson showed her the photos. "Take your time," he told her. "Look at each one carefully. There's no rush." Carol studied the photos, her eyes moving from face to face. Minutes passed. Thompson waited, barely breathing. Then Carol's hand moved to one photo. She pointed to Ted's picture. "I think this is the man," she said. Her voice grew stronger. "I'm sure this is the man." A physical lineup was scheduled for October 2nd. 7 men stood in the lineup, all similar in appearance. Carol walked down the line, studying each face. When she reached Ted, she paused. "I think that's him," she said, then more firmly, "It is him. I am sure." Carol's identification gave police enough evidence for an arrest warrant. On October 23, 1975, detectives arrested Ted Bundy and charged him with aggravated kidnapping and attempted criminal assault in the Carol DeRanche case. Police also obtained a search warrant for Ted's apartment. They found a Colorado map with markings near the area where Karen Campbell's body was discovered, a brochure for Viewmont High School, where Deborah Kent disappeared, climbing guides for mountain areas where bodies had been found. Investigators from multiple states converged on Salt Lake City. In November, detectives from Washington, Utah, and Colorado met in Aspen to compare notes. They laid out all their cases, looking for connections. The pattern became obvious. Similar victims, young women with dark hair parted in the middle. Similar methods, fake injuries, Volkswagen Beetle, blunt force trauma, sexual assault. Similar timeline, 1974-1975. Ted Bundy was their suspect in all of these cases, but they needed more evidence. Hair samples from Ted's car were analyzed. Lab technicians found hair matching 3 different missing women: Karen Campbell, Melissa Smith, and Carol DeRanche. The chances of this being a coincidence were essentially 0. Ted was released on bail, $15,000 paid by his parents, who still believed their son was innocent. He returned to Seattle to stay with Elizabeth Klopfer. But he wasn't free. Not really. Police kept him under close surveillance, following his every move. Elizabeth later described what it was like. "When Ted and I stepped out on the porch to go somewhere, so many unmarked police cars started up that it sounded like the beginning of the Indy 500. The police weren't even trying to hide anymore. They wanted Ted to know they were watching." Ted waited for his trial, growing more anxious by the day. He knew his future hung in the balance. The trial began on February 23, 1976. The courtroom in Salt Lake City was packed with reporters, police officers, and curious onlookers. Everyone wanted to see the charming young man accused of being a serial killer. Before the trial started, Ted made a decision that would prove disastrous. He waived his right to a jury trial. Instead, he chose to be judged by Judge Stuart Hansen alone. Ted thought he could convince one educated man of his innocence. He believed his intelligence and charm would work on the judge. It was a massive tactical error. A jury, 12 regular people, might have been swayed by Ted's good looks and smooth talking. But Judge Stuart Hansen was a seasoned legal professional who had seen every trick in the book. Ted's charm wouldn't work on him. The trial moved quickly. Carol DeRanche took the stand and told her story. She described the fake police officer, the handcuffs, the crowbar, the desperate fight for her life. She pointed across the courtroom at Ted. "That's him," she said firmly. "I'm certain." Ted tried to poke holes in her testimony, but Carol remained steady. The physical evidence backed her up. The handcuffs found in Ted's car matched the brand used in the attack. Witnesses placed Ted's Volkswagen Beetle in the area. The case was strong. 1 week later, on March 1, 1976, the courtroom filled again for the verdict. Judge Hansen looked at Ted and began to speak. "The court finds the defendant, Theodore Robert Bundy, guilty of aggravated kidnapping." The words hit Ted like a physical blow. His face went pale. His hands gripped the table. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was supposed to convince the judge. He was supposed to win. Judge Hansen sentenced him to 1 to 15 years in Utah State Prison. Guards moved forward with handcuffs. Ted's confident facade, the mask he had worn so carefully for so long, finally cracked. His eyes showed panic. His mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came out. He was led away in handcuffs, stumbling slightly, no longer the smooth-talking law student, but a convicted criminal heading to prison. But this was only the beginning. Colorado authorities immediately filed murder charges against Ted for the death of Karen Campbell. Ted would be transferred to Colorado to face trial. His nightmare was just starting, though he still believed he could outsmart the system. From his cell, Ted began planning. He wasn't going to accept imprisonment. He was too intelligent, too special to rot in a cell. He would escape, and he would continue doing what he felt compelled to do. In January 1977, Ted Bundy was transferred from Utah to Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, to await trial for Karen Campbell's murder. Colorado prosecutors felt confident. They had circumstantial evidence, witness testimony, hair samples. The case seemed strong, but Ted had advantages that prosecutors didn't fully appreciate. He was representing himself in the trial, which gave him special privileges. Self-represented defendants needed access to law libraries to research their cases. This meant Ted could move around more freely than typical prisoners. On June 7, 1977, was a preliminary hearing at the Pitkin County Courthouse in Aspen. Ted was transported from Glenwood Springs for the hearing. The courthouse was old, built in 1890, charming but not secure by modern standards. The law library was on the second floor. Judge George Lohr ruled that Ted didn't need to wear leg shackles or handcuffs during hearings since he was acting as his own attorney. Ted needed to be able to move around, access documents, present himself professionally to the court. The judge saw no flight risk. They were in a remote mountain town, and Ted would have nowhere to go. During a recess, Ted asked for permission to visit the law library to research a motion. The deputy on duty allowed it. Ted was left alone in the library. He had been planning this moment for weeks. Ted opened a second-floor window. Below was a jump of about 25 feet. Ted hesitated only briefly, then leapt. He landed hard, rolled, felt his right ankle twist painfully. But he was free. Ted ran. He was wearing street clothes because of the court hearing. He headed toward Aspen Mountain, limping badly on his injured ankle. Behind him, chaos erupted in the courthouse. Deputies realized Ted was gone within minutes. They organized a search immediately. The manhunt for Ted Bundy became the largest search in Colorado history up to that point. Helicopters with infrared scanners searched the mountains. Tracking dogs followed his scent. Hundreds of volunteers combed the wilderness. Roadblocks went up on every highway out of the area. For 6 days, Ted evaded capture. He broke into a cabin on Aspen Mountain, stole food, warm clothes, and a rifle. He stayed there for a few days, resting his injured ankle, listening to news reports about himself on a transistor radio. The entire country was following the story of the escaped serial killer. Ted knew he couldn't stay in the mountains forever. He needed to get out of Colorado. On June 13, 1977, cold, hungry, and limping, Ted made his way back down to Aspen. He stole a Cadillac and started driving. 2 Pitkin County deputies, Gene Flatt and Maureen Higgins, were manning a roadblock on Highway 82. Around 2 in the morning, they noticed a car weaving erratically. They pulled it over. The driver wasn't drunk. He was exhausted, hypothermic, and trying to disguise himself with a wire-rimmed glasses and a hat. Gene Flatt looked at the driver and recognized him immediately. "Welcome back, Ted," he said. Ted's first escape lasted 6 days and ended less than a mile from where it began. He was returned to custody, this time with much tighter security. But the escape had consequences beyond Ted's immediate recapture. The escape generated enormous media attention. Ted Bundy became a national news story. His intelligence, his good looks, his audacity in jumping from a courthouse window, all of it captured public imagination. Some people began to see Ted as a folk hero, a clever outlaw outsmarting authorities. This romanticization disgusted the families of his victims. Visitors had smuggled cash to Ted, particularly Carol Ann Boone. Carol was a woman Ted had worked with years earlier in Washington. While others abandoned Ted after his arrest, Carol believed in his innocence. She had moved to Florida to be near him, visiting the jail 3 or 4 times a week. Her devotion to Ted was absolute, and she was willing to help him in ways that crossed legal lines. Over 6 months, Ted accumulated $500 hidden in his cell, money Carol and possibly others had smuggled to him during visits. This would be enough to get far away once he was free. On December 30th, Ted made his move. He arranged books and pillows under his blanket to create the appearance of a sleeping body. Then he squeezed through the hole in his ceiling into the crawl space above the jail. The space was cramped, filled with wiring and pipes, barely enough room for a person to move. Ted crawled through the darkness, following the building's layout he had memorized. He found an opening that led down into the apartment of the chief jailer, who was out for the evening. Ted dropped down into a closet, changed into civilian clothes belonging to the jailer, and walked out the front door of the jail. Nobody noticed. The skeleton crew didn't do a head count until the next afternoon, more than 17 hours after Ted escaped. By then, Ted was hundreds of miles away. Ted stole a car that broke down quickly in the mountains. He hitchhiked to Vail, 60 miles away, where he caught a bus to Denver. In Denver, he bought a plane ticket to Chicago using a stolen credit card. The card worked. Security was minimal in 1977. Ted flew out of Colorado on December 31st, New Year's Eve. From Chicago, Ted took a train to Ann Arbor, Michigan. He spent a day there, visited a bar, kept moving. On January 2, 1978, he stole a car and drove south to Atlanta. In Atlanta, he boarded a bus to Tallahassee, Florida, arriving on January 8th. Ted chose Florida deliberately. It was far from Colorado, warm in winter, had multiple universities where young women congregated. Tallahassee had Florida State University, a large campus with sorority houses and off-campus apartments. Perfect hunting grounds. Ted rented a room at a boarding house near FSU campus under the name Chris Hagen. The landlord didn't ask for identification or run a background check. Ted paid cash. He settled in, bought supplies, and started watching the campus. For a week, Ted did nothing but watch. He observed the Florida State University campus like a predator studying prey. He noted where young women walked alone at night, which buildings had poor security, which areas were dark and isolated. He was planning something terrible, something that would satisfy the violent urges that had been building and building during his months locked in jail. The night of January 14, 1978, Ted began his final preparations. He moved across the FSU campus under cover of darkness. First, he stole a white Dodge van from a parking lot. Then he went through other parking areas, breaking into cars one by one. He stole credit cards. He took driver's licenses and identification cards. He was building a collection of false identities, tools he would need for whatever came next. The killing started less than 24 hours later, January 15, 1978. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, most of Tallahassee was asleep. The FSU campus was dark and quiet. Ted Bundy walked through the shadows toward the Chi Omega sorority house at 661 West Jefferson Street. He carried a wooden club, just a thick, heavy piece of firewood. But in his hands, it would become a murder weapon. Ted had been circling this building for days, watching it from different angles, learning its rhythms. He knew the back door had a faulty lock. He knew the sorority members had reported it, but it hadn't been fixed. That broken lock would be his way in. Ted pushed open the unsecured rear door. It opened silently. He stepped inside. It was 3 in the morning on a Sunday. The sorority members were all asleep, exhausted after their Saturday night out. The house was completely quiet. No one heard Ted climb the stairs to the second floor. No one saw him move slowly down the hallway, his hand trying each door handle, looking for unlocked rooms, looking for victims. The Chi Omega sorority house was home to 39 young women. You see, in America, the sororities are special organizations at universities where female students live together in group houses and form close bonds like sisters. Young women join sororities for friendship, support, and community. They share living expenses, study together, volunteer for charity work, and build lifelong connections. Each sorority has its own name, usually Greek letters, and its own traditions. Chi Omega, founded in 1895, was one of the largest and oldest sororities in America. At Florida State University, Chi Omega was highly respected. The house itself was a beautiful 2-story brick building, built in 1925, located just 2 blocks from the FSU campus. The women who lived there were excellent students with bright futures, pursuing degrees in nursing, education, business, and art. They studied hard, made lifelong friendships, volunteered in the community, and planned for careers and families. The house should have been safe. It was supposed to be a home away from home, a place where young women could live together, support each other, and feel protected. Parents sent their daughters to live there, believing they would be looked after. The sorority had house rules, a house mother who supervised the residents, and security measures. It was meant to be one of the safest places on campus. That night, 39 young women slept peacefully in their beds, exhausted after a Saturday night of fun. They had no idea a killer was walking through their hallway. What happened next would be the most brutal attack of Ted's killing career. The Chi Omega house would become a crime scene that shocked even experienced homicide detectives. On January 15, 1978, approximately 3 in the morning, Ted Bundy entered the first unlocked bedroom at the Chi Omega sorority house. Margaret Bowman, 21 years old, was asleep. Ted approached the bed and swung his wooden club at Margaret's head. He hit her repeatedly with extreme force. Margaret never woke up, dying from the blunt force trauma within moments. Ted moved to the next room. Lisa Levy, 20 years old, was also sleeping. Ted attacked her with the club, beating her unconscious. Then he bit her on the buttock, leaving distinct teeth marks. He sexually assaulted her with a hairspray bottle from her desk. The attack was frenzied, violent, and personal. A third door opened. Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler were roommates, both asleep in the same room. Ted attacked Kathy first, hitting her head and breaking her jaw. Karen woke during the attack. Ted turned and struck her as well, fracturing her skull. Both women screamed. The screams were muffled but audible. Nita Neary, another sorority member, was returning to the house at that moment. She heard sounds upstairs, saw lights going on and off. Nita moved cautiously up the stairs. At the top, she saw a man leaving through the front door. He carried a wooden club and was moving quickly. Nita only saw his profile for a second, but it was enough to give police a description later. Ted ran from the Chi Omega house. His attack had lasted maybe 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. He was covered in blood, breathing hard, moving on pure adrenaline. He went to a nearby apartment building and broke into the apartment of Cheryl Thomas, another FSU student. Cheryl was sleeping. Ted beat her with the club, inflicting severe head injuries. Cheryl's roommates in the adjacent apartment heard the commotion and called campus police. Ted fled before they arrived. Cheryl survived but suffered permanent hearing loss and other injuries. By dawn, the Chi Omega house was a crime scene. FSU police officer Ray Crew responded to a call about a possible domestic dispute. He arrived expecting a minor incident, maybe a boyfriend-girlfriend fight. Instead, he found 2 dead women and 2 critically injured survivors. Detectives arrived and began processing the scene. The brutality shocked them. Blood spattered the walls and ceiling in multiple rooms. The wooden club was never found. Ted had taken it with him or disposed of it immediately. But forensic technicians found something unusual on Lisa Levy's body, a bite mark on her left buttock. The bite mark was clear, distinctive, showed the pattern of individual teeth. Forensic odontologist Dr. Pat Richard Souveron was called in to photograph and document the marks before Lisa's body was moved. These photographs would become crucial evidence. Police interviewed Nita Neary. She described the man she saw. Medium height, dark hair, wearing dark clothes, carrying something that looked like a club or stick. She had only seen his profile, but she was confident she could identify him if she saw him again. The investigation moved quickly. Police canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed sorority members, collected physical evidence. They discovered the back door lock was broken, had been broken for weeks. Anyone could have entered. Ted had left the area immediately after the attacks. He was paranoid now, convinced police were closing in. He stole license plates, changed cars frequently, moved between cheap motels. He used stolen credit cards to buy food and gas, always moving, never staying in one place more than a day. On February 8, 1978, early afternoon, Ted was in Jacksonville, Florida. He saw a 14-year-old girl walking alone. He attempted to abduct her, but she screamed and ran. Ted fled, realizing he had taken a foolish risk in broad daylight. That same day, Ted drove to Lake City, Florida, a small town about 50 miles west of Jacksonville. He was spiraling, unable to control his impulses, acting recklessly. He was also running low on money. The stolen credit cards were getting canceled. He needed to get out of Florida soon. But first, Ted would commit one more murder, one that would prove to be his undoing. February 9, 1978. late morning. Lake City Junior High School in Lake City, Florida. Kimberly Diane Leach, 12 years old, was in her first period class when she realized she had forgotten her purse. With her teacher's permission, she walked back to her homeroom building to retrieve it. Multiple students saw Kimberly walking across the open campus area between buildings. She was wearing blue jeans, a football jersey with the number 83, and sneakers. She was carrying her purse when she headed back toward her first period class. She never arrived. Kimberly's teacher noticed her absence after 10 minutes and assumed she had been detained somewhere. But when Kimberly didn't appear for second period, concern grew. School administrators checked the campus. No one had seen Kimberly since she left to get her purse. Police were called by noon. Lake City was a small town, fewer than 10,000 people. A missing child mobilized the entire community immediately. Parents picked up their children from school. Volunteers organized search parties. Police interviewed everyone who had seen Kimberly that morning. One witness proved critical. A fireman doing permit inspections at the school that morning saw a man in a white van approach a young girl matching Kimberly's description. The man appeared to be talking to her, then the girl walked with him toward the van. The fireman didn't think much of it at the time, assumed it was her father or another parent. Now he realized what he had seen. Ted had abducted Kimberly and driven her out of Lake City to a remote location. Forensic evidence would later suggest Kimberly had been held alive for some period before being killed. For Kimberly's parents, Tom and Freda Leach, the nightmare was just beginning. They appeared on television daily, begging for information about their daughter. The town of Lake City maintained hope that Kimberly might be found alive, but as days turned into weeks, that hope began to fade. Meanwhile, police were closing in. Investigators in Tallahassee had connected the Chi Omega murders to other cases across multiple states. Composite sketches from Lake Sammamish in Washington, 1974, were compared to witness descriptions from Chi Omega. They matched. Detectives also realized something important. Ted Bundy, the escaped Colorado prisoner, had not been captured since his December 30th escape. Ted was suspected in murders across multiple states. If he was in Florida, he could be the Chi Omega killer. Police began looking for Ted specifically. Credit card records provided a trail. Ted had been using stolen cards for weeks, leaving electronic breadcrumbs. Investigators tracked his movements through gas station charges, hotel bills, and restaurant receipts. The pattern showed someone moving erratically around Florida, never staying in one place for long. Ted was still free, still running, still using stolen credit cards to survive. But his time was running out. On February 15, 1978, 1:30 in the morning, only 6 days after Kimberly Leach's abduction, West Pensacola, Florida, near the Alabama state line. Pensacola police officer David Lee was patrolling a residential area when he noticed an orange Volkswagen Beetle driving slowly, as if the driver were looking for something. Officer Lee ran the license plate. The car came back stolen from Tallahassee. Lee activated his lights and pulled behind the Volkswagen. The car didn't stop immediately. It accelerated slightly, turned corners, then finally pulled over. Lee approached carefully. The driver was a white male, late 20s or early 30s, seemed nervous. Lee asked for license and registration. The driver said his name was Kenneth Misner, but he couldn't produce any identification. He claimed he had borrowed the car from a friend. Lee asked the driver to step out. Something felt wrong. The driver was too nervous, his explanations too smooth but ultimately nonsensical. Lee told the man he was under arrest for driving a stolen vehicle. That's when Ted Bundy attacked. He kicked Lee's legs out from under him, knocking the officer to the ground. Ted ran. Lee scrambled to his feet, drew his weapon, and fired a warning shot. Ted kept running. Lee chased him and fired again, this time closer. Ted stopped. He raised his hands. "Okay, you got me," he said. Lee handcuffed him, breathing hard, adrenaline pumping. The policeman didn't yet realize who had just been captured. In the patrol car on the way to jail, Ted was quiet for a moment, then said to Lee, "I wish you had killed me." Later he asked, "If I run at the jail, will you shoot me then?" At the jail, Ted was booked under the name Kenneth Misner. He maintained this false identity for several hours. But fingerprints don't lie. When the prints came back, They matched Theodore Robert Bundy, wanted for escape from Colorado, suspected in murders across multiple states. Within 24 hours, detectives from Tallahassee, Lake City, and Colorado were converging on Pensacola. They all wanted to interview Ted about different cases. The pressure was building to charge him with crimes that could put him away permanently. Ted initially refused to talk without an attorney, but his ego couldn't resist entirely. He made comments, half-admissions, vague statements that suggested knowledge of crimes. Detectives recorded everything, knowing these statements might be useful later. Evidence technicians searched the orange Volkswagen Ted had been driving. Inside they found keys to the Chi Omega sorority house that Ted had somehow obtained. Credit card receipts connecting Ted to locations and times matching unsolved crimes. Most importantly, fabric samples collected from the car. Forensic analysis would later show that fibers found in the Volkswagen matched clothing worn by Kimberly Leach on the day she disappeared. This physical evidence directly linked Ted to her abduction. Detectives also examined Ted's appearance closely. His teeth were crooked, chipped, and showed distinctive spacing. Forensic odontologist Dr. Richard Souveron was asked to make dental impressions of Ted's teeth. These impressions would be compared to the bite mark on Lisa Levy's body from the Chi Omega attack. Ted fought the dental impressions initially. He understood the implications. A bite mark match was devastating physical evidence, harder to explain away than circumstantial connections, but the court ordered him to comply. Dr. Souveron compared the impressions to photographs of the bite mark on Lisa Levy. The match was obvious even to non-experts. The distinctive spacing of Ted's teeth, the chipped incisor, the alignment pattern, all corresponded perfectly to the marks on the victim. Ted was formally charged with the Chi Omega murders. Both cases carried the death penalty in Florida. From his jail cell, Ted requested to speak with detectives from Colorado, Washington, and Utah. He wanted to negotiate, to trade information for a life sentence rather than execution. But prosecutors refused. The evidence against Ted was strong. They didn't need his confessions. Nearly 2 months after Kimberly disappeared, a man driving through rural Suwannee County noticed a strong smell coming from an abandoned pig farrowing shed near Suwannee River State Park. He investigated and found human remains. Police were called immediately. The body was badly decomposed and partially skeletonized. Animals had scattered some remains, but enough evidence existed for identification. Clothing fragments, particularly the football jersey with number 83, confirmed this was Kimberly Leach. She had been dead for approximately 2 months. Forensic pathologists determined Kimberly had been sexually assaulted and her throat had been cut. The savagery of the crime against such a young victim outraged investigators and the public. Ted Bundy had murdered many women, but Kimberly represented a new low, a child taken from school in broad daylight. Ted was already in custody when Kimberly's body was found. Separate charges for her murder would be filed later, also carrying the death penalty. Theodore Bundy's trial for the Chi Omega murders officially began in June 25, 1979. Miami, Florida. The trial was historic. The first criminal trial in American history to be televised nationally. Cameras in the courtroom broadcast every moment to millions of viewers. Ted insisted on representing himself, though he had standby attorneys available. This decision reflected his arrogance and his belief that he was smarter than any lawyer. Ted thought he could perform for the cameras, win over the jury, and secure an acquittal through sheer force of personality. Judge Edward Cowart presided. Cowart was experienced, patient, and insisted on proper courtroom procedure. He allowed Ted considerable latitude in presenting his defense, but maintained firm control over the proceedings. The prosecution, led by Larry Simpson, built their case methodically. They called sorority members who described the scene on the morning of January 15, 1978. The testimony was disturbing. Blood in multiple bedrooms, 2 women dead, 2 critically injured, chaos and terror in a place that should have been safe. Nita Neary took the stand. She described returning to the Chi Omega house early that morning, hearing noises, seeing a man flee. When prosecutors showed her a lineup of photos, Nita identified Ted Bundy. "I am positive," she said. Ted cross-examined her aggressively, trying to shake her certainty, but she remained firm. The forensic evidence was devastating. Dr. Richard Souveron, the forensic odontologist, explained bite mark analysis to the jury. He showed them enlarged photographs of the bite mark on Lisa Levy's buttock, then showed them impressions of Ted's teeth. The match was obvious. Dr. Souveron pointed out specific details: the distinctive spacing of Ted's teeth, a chipped incisor, misalignment patterns. Each of these features appeared in the bite mark. Using overlays, he demonstrated how Ted's dental pattern aligned perfectly with the wound. The probability of this being a coincidence was essentially zero. Ted objected repeatedly, challenged the scientific validity of bite mark analysis, argued the evidence was prejudicial. Judge Cowart overruled most objections. The evidence was admissible, and the jury needed to see it. The defense case was weak. Ted called character witnesses who testified he was intelligent, personable, not violent, but character testimony couldn't overcome physical evidence. Ted had no alibi for January 15th. He couldn't explain the bite mark match. His cross-examination of witnesses was ineffective, sometimes antagonistic. On July 24, 1979, after deliberating less than 7 hours, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts: 2 counts of first-degree murder for Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, 3 counts of attempted murder for the surviving victims, and 2 counts of burglary. The penalty phase began immediately. The jury had to decide: life in prison or death. Prosecutors argued the murders were especially heinous, atrocious, and cruel. The brutality of the attacks, the vulnerability of the victims, the number of victims, all supported a death sentence. Ted addressed the jury directly in a rambling speech about his character and his future. He claimed he could contribute to society, could help prevent crime, deserved a chance to prove himself. The speech was narcissistic, lacking any real remorse or acknowledgement of his victims' suffering. The jury recommended death. On July 31st, Judge Cowart formally imposed 3 death sentences, 1 for each murder plus additional time for the other convictions. Judge Cowart's comments at sentencing became famous. He told Ted, "You went the wrong way, partner. Take care of yourself. I don't feel any animosity toward you. I want you to know that. But you went the wrong way, partner." The words seemed almost kind, a recognition that Ted had wasted his potential. In July 1979, Theodore Bundy entered death row at Florida State Prison in Rayford. He was 32 years old, convicted of the Chi Omega murders. The appeals process would take years, possibly a decade. Ted had time to think, to reflect, to come to terms with what he had done. He didn't reflect. He didn't come to terms. Instead, Ted spent his death row years trying to maintain control, to manipulate situations, to feel important. He granted interviews, wrote letters, involved himself in other criminal investigations. He couldn't accept that his life was effectively over. But Ted wasn't done facing justice. There was still one more trial waiting for him. In January 1980, Ted was transferred to Orlando, Florida, for another trial. This one was for the murder of Kimberly Leach. This trial was different from Chi Omega. The victim was a child, a 12-year-old girl taken from school in broad daylight, held captive and killed. The emotional impact was even stronger than the Chi Omega case. The evidence was overwhelming. The fireman who saw Ted approach Kimberly testified. Forensic experts presented fiber analysis showing that materials from Ted's van matched Kimberly's clothing. Witnesses placed Ted in Lake City on February 9, 1978, the day Kimberly disappeared. The jury deliberated and found Ted guilty. On February 12, 1980, Ted received his 3rd death sentence. His appeals would continue, but the outcome was now certain. Ted Bundy would die in Florida's electric chair. Back on death row, Ted tried to stay busy, to stay relevant. In March 1980, journalists Stephen McCaud and Hugh Ainsworth approached Ted about writing a book. Ted agreed immediately. He saw this as an opportunity to tell his story, to shape his legacy, to control how people remembered him. The interviews began right away and would continue sporadically for years. Ted refused to confess directly. He wouldn't say, "I killed these women." Instead, he spoke in the 3rd person about the killer, or the person who did this. He described psychological theories, motives, methods, always at arm's length. This verbal gymnastics allowed Ted to discuss his crimes without technically admitting guilt. Over 100 hours of interviews were recorded. Ted described his childhood, his relationships, his time in Utah and Colorado. When discussing murders, he slipped into third person. The person would approach the victim, or the entity felt compelled. This dissociation was Ted's final manipulation, avoiding responsibility even while describing what he had done. Meanwhile, in Washington state, another serial killer was terrorizing the Seattle area. Between 1982 and 1984, dozens of young women had disappeared or been found murdered. Most were prostitutes and runaways, vulnerable women no one was looking for. Their bodies were discovered in wooded areas along the Green River south of Seattle. The case was massive and frustrating. Police had found over 40 victims but had no solid leads, no suspects, and no clear pattern they could use to predict the killer's next move. The Green River Killer was careful, methodical, and seemed to be getting away with murder on a scale that shocked even experienced detectives. Detective Bob Keppel had investigated Ted Bundy's Washington murders in the 1970s. He remembered how intelligent and organized Ted had been. Keppel thought, who better to understand a serial killer's mind than another serial killer? He decided to contact Ted on death row to ask for his help in profiling the Green River Killer. Ted agreed enthusiastically. He saw this as a chance to demonstrate his expertise, to feel useful and respected, to be treated as an authority rather than a monster. For Ted, it was an ego boost, proof that he was special, that his intelligence made him valuable even from behind bars. The interviews were extensive. Ted explained how a serial killer might think, where he might dump bodies, how he might select victims, how he might avoid detection. He talked about the psychology of hunting, the need for control, the patterns that killers follow, even when they think they're being random. Some of Ted's suggestions proved useful to the investigation. He explained why the killer chose certain dump sites, how he likely returned to the bodies, what kind of person police should be looking for. Ted's insights helped detectives understand the mind of the person they were hunting. However, the Green River Killer would not be arrested until 2001, 17 years later, and 12 years after Ted's execution. His name was Gary Ridgway, a married truck painter who had been killing women for nearly 2 decades. DNA evidence finally connected him to the murders. He eventually confessed to killing at least 49 women, though the actual number was likely much higher. Ridgway was everything Ted had described: organized, careful, returning to dump sites, targeting vulnerable women who wouldn't be missed immediately. In death, Ted Bundy had helped catch another monster. An execution date was finally set for March 4, 1986. Ted's appeals were running out. With death looming, Ted made a decision. He began confessing to FBI Special Agent Bill Hagmaier and his attorney Polly Nelson. The confessions were still vague, still incomplete. Ted described murders in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, California, and Florida. He admitted to 30 homicides, gave details about victim selection, disposal sites, methods, but even now, Ted withheld information. He refused to name some victims and wouldn't reveal all burial locations. Ted's confession strategy was transparent. He was trading information for time. Each new detail, each body location, each victim identification was a bargaining chip. Ted hoped authorities would delay his execution to learn more. Florida Governor Bob Martinez was not interested in bargaining. The confessions devastated Carol Ann Boone. Carol had stood by Ted through everything. She had even helped him escape from jail in Colorado. Back in 1977, before Ted's second escape from Garfield County Jail, Carol had visited him regularly. Evidence suggested she smuggled cash to Ted during these visits, money he accumulated over 6 months, eventually totaling $500. This money funded his escape to Florida, where he would commit his most brutal murders. Carol had risked everything for Ted, even breaking the law to help him. She truly believed he was innocent, wrongly imprisoned, deserving of freedom. When he escaped in December 1977, she may have thought she was helping a good man escape injustice. She had no idea she was helping unleash a killer who would murder 3 more young women, including a 12-year-old child. After Ted's arrest in Florida, Carol's devotion only grew stronger. She moved to Florida, found work in Gainesville, and visited Ted in jail constantly. She married him in a dramatic courtroom ceremony during his Chi Omega murder trial in June 1979, declaring, "I do," while Ted was on the witness stand. She believed in his innocence completely, even as a jury found him guilty and sentenced him to death. She visited Ted on death row regularly, sometimes 3 or 4 times a week. Through methods never fully explained, though bribed guards were suspected, Carol became pregnant. On October 24, 1982, she gave birth to Ted's daughter, a little girl they named Rose. For years, Carol defended Ted publicly. She raised their daughter alone while maintaining the fiction that Ted was innocent, that he had been wrongly convicted, that someday the truth would come out and he would be freed. She had invested everything, her reputation, her life, her daughter's future, in believing Ted. Now, in 1986, Ted was confessing to dozens of murders. He was admitting to killing young women in Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, Idaho, California, and Florida. He was describing details that only the killer could know. The man Carol had loved, married, had a child with, and even helped escape from jail was a monster. Carol felt betrayed, humiliated, destroyed by the revelation of who Ted really was. Everything had been a lie. He had manipulated her for years, used her devotion to help him escape, to maintain some semblance of normal life while he sat on death row. She had unknowingly helped him commit more murders. She had brought their innocent daughter to visit a serial killer, believing he was just a wrongly accused man. The guilt must have been overwhelming. Her money had helped Ted escape. Her belief in him had enabled him to continue killing. Kimberly Leach, Margaret Bowman, Lisa Levy, Cheryl Thomas, their blood was partly on her hands, even though she never knew what Ted truly was. Carol stopped visiting immediately. She filed for divorce in 1986. By 1987, she had moved back to Washington with 7-year-old Rose, trying to rebuild their lives away from the nightmare Ted had created. Ted tried calling her, writing letters, begging her to bring Rose to visit one more time. Carol refused all contact. She wanted nothing more to do with him. She had to protect Rose, had to give her daughter a chance at a normal life away from the shadow of Ted Bundy. Ted had one more card to play, the Bones for Time scheme. He offered to reveal the locations of additional victims' bodies in exchange for stays of execution. Family members of victims were approached, asked to petition for delay so Ted could provide closure. Every family refused. They wanted Ted executed, wanted this nightmare to end. "We already believed the victims were dead and that Ted had killed them," wrote Polly Nelson. They didn't need his confession. Ted's final days were spent giving last-minute interviews, making frantic phone calls to attorneys, hoping for a miracle reprieve that never came. On January 23rd, the day before his execution, Ted sat down for one final interview that would become infamous and controversial. Ted requested a meeting with Dr. James Dobson, a fundamentalist Christian psychologist. Dobson was known for his strong anti-pornography campaigns. Ted wanted this specific interviewer for a very specific purpose, one last manipulation. The interview was filmed in Ted's cell and would be broadcast the day after his execution. Ted sat in prison clothes, looking gaunt and tired after years on death row. His execution was scheduled for less than 24 hours away. Dobson asked questions about Ted's childhood, his crimes, and what led him down this path of violence. Ted provided a well-rehearsed answer that would spark controversy for decades. He claimed he grew up in a fine, solid Christian home with loving parents. There was no abuse, he said. His family was supportive and normal. But as a young teenager, Ted discovered pornography. First, softcore materials found in trash cans and dumpsters, then harder content, then violent pornography depicting rape and murder. According to Ted, this pornography addiction caused his crimes. He claimed that the violent images fueled fantasies that eventually required real victims to satisfy. Ted said he was warning society about the dangers of pornography, hoping his example would motivate restrictions on adult materials and prevent other young men from following his path. Those of us who have been so influenced by violence in the media, particularly pornographic violence, are not some kind of inherent monsters, Ted said to Dobson. We are your sons and husbands. We grew up in regular families. Ted claimed pornography had snatched him, that he was powerless against the addiction it created. He presented himself as a victim, not of his own choices, but of society's failure to restrict pornographic materials. Experts who had studied Ted's case rejected the pornography explanation. FBI profiler Robert Ressler stated he was looking for a last-minute reversal or at least a stay of execution. The things he was saying in those last days, it was all self-serving. I didn't believe him at all. After the Dobson interview, Ted spoke with FBI Special Agent Bill Hagmaier one final time. This conversation was more honest than the performance for Dobson. Ted confirmed specific murders, gave details about how he selected victims and disposed of bodies, described his progression from fantasy to violent action. He admitted that the compulsion to kill had been present long before any exposure to pornography. It was something inside him from his teenage years. That evening, Ted called his mother, Louise Bundy, twice. The calls were deeply emotional. Louise had supported Ted throughout his trials, visiting him regularly, maintaining belief in his innocence, even as mountains of evidence piled up against him. She had never fully accepted that her son was a serial killer. You'll always be my precious son, Louise told Ted through tears. Ted broke down crying. For a moment, the mask slipped, and he was just a man facing death, talking to his mother one last time. Ted tried calling Carol Ann Boone, his ex-wife and mother of his daughter Rose. She refused the call. She wanted no part of Ted's final hours. The man she had loved and defended for years had destroyed her life with his lies. Ted also tried calling Elizabeth Klopfer, his girlfriend from the 1970s, who had reported him to police multiple times out of growing suspicion. Elizabeth didn't answer either. Both women had moved on, trying to rebuild their lives away from Ted's shadow. That night, Ted met with Reverend Fred Lawrence, a Methodist minister. They prayed together for hours. Ted claimed to have accepted Christianity, to have asked God for forgiveness, to have made peace with his fate. He said he was ready to die. Whether this religious conversion was genuine or just another performance is impossible to know. Ted had spent his entire life manipulating people, wearing masks, saying whatever would get him what he wanted. Even facing execution, he may have been playing a role, the repentant sinner seeking salvation, rather than genuinely confronting what he had done. Ted was offered a special last meal, as was customary for condemned prisoners. He could have ordered almost anything. Ted refused to make a request. Prison officials served him the standard breakfast meal: medium-rare steak, eggs over easy, hash browns, toast with butter and jelly, milk, juice, and coffee. The meal was delivered to Ted's cell around 5 in the morning. Ted looked at it, but didn't touch it. He ate nothing. Perhaps his stomach was too twisted with anxiety. Perhaps he was making one final gesture of control, refusing to participate in even this small ritual. At 6 in the morning, guards came for Ted to begin the final preparations. A prison barber shaved Ted's head and his right leg. The shaving was necessary to ensure proper electrical contact with the electrodes that would deliver the fatal current. Ted sat silently during this process, his face expressionless. He was dressed in his execution clothes and moved to a holding cell directly adjacent to the execution chamber. Through the wall, he could probably hear technicians making final checks on Old Sparky, Florida's electric chair. Outside Florida State Prison, hundreds of people had gathered overnight, camping out to witness this moment. The crowd had been building since the previous evening. By dawn, it was a full carnival atmosphere. People held homemade signs with slogans like "Burn Bundy Burn," "Tuesday is Friday," and "Thank God it's Friday." Vendors sold T-shirts with similar messages, making money off Ted's execution. Some people brought portable grills and held tailgate parties, cooking breakfast and celebrating as if at a football game. The carnival atmosphere appalled victim advocates and law enforcement professionals who felt it diminished the solemnity of justice being served. But it also reflected genuine public anger at Ted's crimes and relief that this monster would finally be stopped permanently. For years, people had followed his crimes, his trials, his escapes. Now finally, it was ending. At 7 in the morning, guards opened the holding cell. "It's time," one of them said quietly. Ted stood. His hands were cuffed behind his back. Guards flanked him on either side. They walked the short distance from the holding cell to the execution chamber. Ted moved slowly but steadily, showing no visible emotion. The execution chamber was small, about 12 feet by 18 feet. In the center sat Old Sparky, Florida's electric chair, constructed from oak in 1923. It had been used to execute hundreds of condemned prisoners over the decades. Today it would claim one more. Official witnesses filled the rows of seats facing the chair. Law enforcement officers who had worked Ted's cases, state officials, selected media representatives, prison staff. All eyes watched as Ted was brought in. Guards guided Ted to the chair. He sat down. His face remained blank, showing neither fear nor remorse. Guards moved efficiently, strapping Ted in with multiple leather restraints: chest, arms, wrists, legs, ankles. A strap secured his head to the back of the chair so it wouldn't move during the electrical jolts. Electrodes were attached to Ted's shaved head and right leg. A black leather mask was placed over his face, both for dignity and so witnesses wouldn't have to see his face during the execution. Superintendent Tom Barton, the prison warden, stepped forward. "Theodore Robert Bundy, do you have any last words?" Behind the mask, Ted's voice was quiet but clear. "Jim and Fred, I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." That was all. No apology to victims, no expression of remorse, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. Just a message to his friends. Jim Coleman, one of his attorneys, and Fred Lawrence, the minister who had prayed with him the night before. The warden stepped back and gave the signal. In a separate room, a masked executioner waited by a control panel. When the signal came, he threw the switch. 2,000 volts of electricity surged through Ted's body. His muscles contracted violently. His body strained against the leather straps with tremendous force. The straps held. The first jolt lasted exactly 30 seconds. The current was stopped. Ted's body relaxed slightly but remained rigid, tensed. Prison doctors monitoring his vital signs waited a moment, then signaled for a second jolt. The executioner threw the switch again. Another 2,000 volts. Another 30 seconds. Ted's body convulsed again, then went still. The medical team checked. Ted's heart had stopped. His breathing had ceased. There was no brain activity. "Time of death, 7:16 a.m., announced the prison doctor. Theodore Robert Bundy was dead. He was 42 years old. The execution had taken 10 minutes from the time he entered the chamber until death was confirmed. Outside the prison, someone in the crowd had a radio and heard the announcement. He shouted to the others, "He's dead. Bundy's dead." A massive cheer erupted. Fireworks were set off, exploding in the early morning sky. People hugged each other. Some sang, others danced. Car horns honked. It was a celebration, pure and simple. Relief and joy that Ted Bundy was finally gone from the world. The spectacle disturbed many observers. Death, even the death of a monster, shouldn't be celebrated like a sports victory, they argued. It diminished the seriousness of justice, turned execution into entertainment. But others understood the crowd's reaction. Ted had terrorized communities across America. He had killed dozens of women, maybe over 100. He had escaped from jail twice and killed more victims. He had manipulated the legal system with appeals and delays. For 11 years since his final arrest, families had waited for closure, for justice, for this nightmare to end. Now it was over. Ted could never hurt anyone again. However, for the families of Ted's victims, the execution brought mixed emotions. Some felt relief that Ted was finally gone, that he could never hurt anyone else. Others felt empty, realizing that Ted's death didn't bring their loved ones back or heal their trauma. Carol Duranch, who escaped from Ted in 1974 and whose testimony helped convict him, released a statement. "I feel a sense of relief that he has been held accountable for what he did. It's been a long 14 years." The Leach family, parents of 12-year-old Kimberly, attended a small memorial service in Lake City. They had waited 11 years for justice. Tom Leach told reporters, "We can start to move forward now. The nightmare is over." Elizabeth Klopfer, Ted's partner from the 1970s, made no public statement. She had spent 15 years trying to understand how she loved and lived with a serial killer, how she missed the signs, how she survived the guilt. Ted's execution didn't erase those questions. Carol Ann Boone, Ted's ex-wife, was living quietly in Washington with their daughter Rose. She refused all media requests. Her belief in Ted's innocence had been destroyed by his confessions. Now she wanted to protect her daughter and rebuild their lives away from Ted's legacy. The remains of many of Ted's victims had never been found. He had taken that information to his death, refusing to provide complete details about burial locations or even confirm all the identities of those he killed. Families waited for answers that would never come. Estimates of Ted's total victim count ranged from 30 to over 100. He confessed to 30 murders, but investigators believed there were many more. Some victims were probably never reported missing. Some disappeared from areas where Ted traveled but wasn't known to be active. The true number would remain unknown. Ted's body was cremated. There was no funeral, no public memorial. His ashes were scattered at an undisclosed location in Washington's Cascade Mountains, according to his wishes. Even in death, Ted maintained some control over his story. 45 years after his first murder, Ted Bundy remains one of the most studied criminals in history. Dozens of books have been written about him. Television documentaries revisit his crimes regularly. Movies depict his life, his trials, his execution. This continued fascination says something disturbing about our culture. Ted became a celebrity killer. His good looks, intelligence, and courtroom drama made him compelling to audiences. Some people defended him, claimed he was innocent, romanticized him as a misunderstood anti-hero. This romanticization horrified victims' families and revealed a troubling tendency to focus on charismatic criminals rather than their victims. The women Ted murdered deserve to be remembered as individuals, not as statistics. Linda Ann Healy was studying psychology and giving ski reports on the radio. Donna Gale Manson played flute and loved jazz music. George Ann Hawkins was planning to be a teacher. Each victim had dreams, families, futures that Ted destroyed. 12-year-old Kimberly Leach was in 7th grade, played sports, loved animals. Her parents spent the rest of their lives dealing with the trauma of her abduction and murder. Tom Leach died in 2003, his health destroyed by stress and grief. Freda Leach lived until 2019, carrying the pain of losing her daughter for 41 years. The survivors of Ted's attacks also deserve recognition. Carol Duranche's courage in escaping and testifying helped capture Ted. She lived with trauma, but turned her experience into advocacy for victims' rights. Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, who survived the Chi Omega attacks, rebuilt their lives while dealing with physical and psychological scars. Elizabeth Klopfer wrote a book in 1981 about her relationship with Ted. She used a pseudonym to protect herself and her daughter. The book provided insight into how Ted manipulated those closest to him, how he maintained a false identity while committing murders. Elizabeth struggled with guilt, wondering if she could have stopped Ted earlier. The Ted Bundy case reminds us that evil can hide behind a pleasant face, that charm and intelligence don't indicate goodness, that vigilance and skepticism are necessary for safety. It reminds us that justice, though sometimes slow, can be achieved. Thank you for watching this documentary on the Ted Bundy case. If you found this information valuable and want to see more in-depth true crime documentaries, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support helps us continue creating well-researched, respectful content that honors the victims while examining the psychology behind these crimes. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, and share this video with anyone interested in criminal psychology and true crime history. Stay safe, and we'll see you in the next documentary.